Um, Doug Gilmer is coming to us from DHS HSI, Homeland Security Investigations in Alabama. He previously served as the resident agent in charge for the HSI offices in Birmingham and Montgomery. Before moving to Alabama, he was the DHS senior liaison to the FBI's Counterterrorism Division and the deputy unit chief for the National Joint Terrorism Task Force Group Supervisor for the Joint Terrorism Task Force National Security Group for the HSI Special Agent in Charge Office in DC and Virginia, Section Chief in the National Security Unit, Acting Section Chief for the National Security Unit, and Unit Chief for the Human Rights Violators and War Crimes Unit and Human Rights Violators and War Crimes Center. Before becoming a special agent with USINS and then HSI, he served in local and state law enforcement in Michigan and North Carolina. He retired from the Coast Guard Reserve in 2019 as the Command Master Chief for the Coast Guard's 5th District. It was through the Coast Guard where I met him. He was my Command Master Chief when we were both stationed together in Baltimore. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Interdisciplinary Studies from Liberty, a Master of Natural Resources and Global Sustainability from Virginia Tech, and he is almost done with his PhD in Organizational Leadership from Columbia International University in South Carolina, and is actually going to be graduating in just a few months. So early congratulations.
Thank you.
Tonight, he is going to be speaking on human trafficking and public health. I've had a lot of students, especially in 410, who have been interested in this topic, and I knew that this was Doug's area, which is why I asked him to come speak to us. So Doug, thank you so much for coming tonight, and we look forward to your talk.
Well, great. Well, I certainly appreciate it. I thank you for the invitation and the chance to speak, and just some of the other interaction that we've had on the student project that we've been working on together, Jennifer. So certainly appreciate that. Human trafficking today is it's a big topic in the media. It is a big enforcement issue. It's a big issue within our communities. It's a public health issue. It's a crime issue. It really kind of spans all spectrums of society, and we'll talk a little bit about that. It really didn't gain a lot of notoriety really until about 10 years ago, is when the conversation about human trafficking really began to kind of perpetuate. There was a series of movies that came out called Taken with Liam Neeson, which kind of perpetuated a lot of the discussion about what human trafficking is and that kind of thing. There were some events in the media in the news cycle that perpetuated some of that. And then there was an increase in awareness. I think within the Department of Homeland Security, the DHS Blue campaign was created, which is the government's primary source for educating the general public really about what human trafficking is. And we also educate law enforcement agencies and that kind of thing in areas of human trafficking. And so the topic began to become more and more mainstream. The problem with that was that there were also a lot of misconceptions about what human trafficking is and isn't, and some mistakes that were being made and as far as the terminology and that kind of thing. So anybody, and obviously I can't really see everybody because most people have their cameras off, but can anybody take a wager and wager a guess as to what human trafficking is?
Well, Doug, this is Gene Linkrich. I don't know. I guess that was kind of the first question I was going to ask, or what I wanted to hear about is, so do we, I mean, is it sex? Is it immigrants? Is it, and so I guess I really am interested to see how you define it. It's got to be big, though.
Yeah. So I'll give you, I'm going to give you the legal definition of what human trafficking is. And then I will, I'll kind of, I'll boil it down to kind of a very simple definition. The legal definition of human trafficking, and there are really two types of human trafficking, two basic types of human trafficking. There's sex trafficking and there's labor trafficking. So sex trafficking is defined in which a commercial sex act, meaning that there is an exchange of something of value for a sexual act. It doesn't have to be money. It could be food, it could be lodging, it could be drugs, it could be anything for which there's value. So anything in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform that sex act has not yet attained 18 years of age. So there are three potential elements to sex trafficking: force, fraud, or coercion. Force is pretty easy for us to kind of get our mind around. That is, if you don't do this, I'm going to kill you. If you don't do this, I'm going to beat you. Sometimes it's threats of force, sometimes it's actual force. And we see force used as a tool to induce people into commercial sex on a regular basis. There is fraud. So sometimes people are duped into sex trafficking, thinking that they're actually going to be doing one thing, but instead they're doing this other more horrible thing. So, we've had instances where, for instance, foreign nationals, females from Hungary and the Ukraine, have come to the United States believing that they were going to be dancers on Broadway. They are performers on Broadway or ballet dancers in New York City, only to arrive in New York City and be taken and sold into commercial sex. Hey, Celine. So that's a form of fraud. You're being lied to. You're being tricked into this. Coercion sometimes is a little bit harder to define. It can be, coercion can be defined or can include threats. Oftentimes coercion is the use of drugs. So drug use among human trafficking victims is very high. There's a lot of opioid addiction and that type of thing. And so, traffickers they may withhold drugs from a person in order to get them to do what it is they want them to do. And, they'll pay them they know that they're addicted. And they'll tell them that if you don't do this, then you're not going to get your next fix. So coercion is a very, very broad definition. We have to look at each instance, in and of itself to see if it meets the guidelines of what coercion is. But force, fraud, or coercion, those are the elements that are involved in commercial sex or sex trafficking. And again, a person who has not yet reached the age of 18. So a minor, by definition under federal law. Here in Alabama, you're considered a minor for the purposes of trafficking if you're under the age of 19. So some states have stricter laws, but if you are a minor by law, by federal law, by state law, you cannot consent to a commercial sex act. So where an adult could say, well, I did this willingly, a minor can't say that legally. And so if they're under the age of 18, they're being exploited for commercial sex. It's sex trafficking. Labor trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjecting that person to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, slavery, forced child labor, whatever the case might be. So it's very similar really to the sex trafficking, except the commodity is different. With sex trafficking, it's sex. With labor trafficking, it's some type of work or service or labor that's being provided. We get these concepts a lot of times confused, and the media, the news media, does a very good job of confusing these concepts sometimes, in which they call human smuggling human trafficking. And human smuggling is an entirely separate crime. So human smuggling is the importation of people into the United States. It's with the for profit, with the sole intent of evading U.S. immigration laws. That's in essence, the U.S. definition. That definition is pretty consistent no matter where you are in the world. And when we talk about human smuggling, the whole idea is that human smuggling is the intentional, unlawful movement of people for profit with the intent of evading law enforcement, basically. Here's where we can kind of boil down and differentiate between these two crimes. Human smuggling is a crime against a border. Human trafficking is a crime against a person. Human smuggling, by definition, involves transportation. You have to move people. Human trafficking, even though the word trafficking has the root word traffic in it, there's no requirement that a person be moved from one place to another in order to prove the crime of human trafficking. So human smuggling is a crime of transportation. Human trafficking is a crime of exploitation. And we have instances where we recover human trafficking victims that have never left their city, their county. Sometimes they've never left their neighborhood, but they are victims of human trafficking because it's not about a place. It's not about where they've traveled. It's really about the exploitation that's taking place, really about what's taking place to them. So it's not human trafficking, human smuggling, two very different things. And what human trafficking is not is what is often portrayed in the media. Or on social media. You see a lot of reports. You see a lot of reports on social media, on Facebook, neighborhood groups, that kind of thing, about someone putting, tying a ribbon around the car antenna, or putting a zip tie on a door handle, or white vans, and white vans driving around, and the white vans are in the neighborhood to kidnap the kids, or the strange person at Walmart that has followed you and your kids around, and they're out there ready to abduct your kids and sell them into sex trafficking. Those are a lot of Those are urban myths. That's not what sex trafficking is. It expends a lot of time for law enforcement when we get those calls, because we still have to look into those things. We still have to expend energy on those things. But the truth is, there are not just a lot of people in white vans who are driving around looking to kidnap kids and sell them into sex slavery. That's not to say that doesn't happen in certain parts of the world, but it doesn't happen here. I think statistically, 0.5% of kidnapping victims are actually then sold into sex slavery or become involved in sex trafficking operations. Statistically, it's almost, I mean, it's an insignificant amount statistically. That's not to say that there aren't people, that there aren't kids who are kidnapped. It happens. We see it in the news on an all too regular basis. But the people who typically commit those crimes, they have motivations, just as evil motivations, but motivations that are not sex trafficking. It's sexual abuse, it's rape, it's murder, whatever the case might be, but it's not sex trafficking. Again, not to say that there aren't strange people at Walmart that follow people around, or that person at Walmart might not have evil intent. But it's probably not to kidnap you or your children and sell you into sex slavery. And the same thing with the white vans. We would get there was a time about a year and a half ago where literally every day we were getting calls and reports about white vans in a neighborhood. And a lot of times these people, they just knew that the drivers of these vans were there to kidnap people and sell them into sex trafficking. And when in reality, they were just contractors that had white vans. White vans are the cheapest vans to buy. It got to the point where we'd start asking questions about, hey, does the van that you see parked down the street, does it have ladders on top? If you walk outside the front door, do you see people maybe working on a house near that van? Because the calls became so regular, to us, and they were taking up so much time, that we really had to kind of push back on that narrative. I often tell people, and I tell parents, especially when I'm talking to them, that I can guarantee that there is a sexual predator, there is someone looking to harm your kid within just a few strokes of a keyboard or taps on an app on their phone, than there are in their neighborhood looking to snatch your kids. The online threat is really where we have to pay a lot of our attention. And in reality, that's where a lot of the grooming process for human trafficking begins. Today, it largely begins online, with relationships that are established between a kid and a stranger, someone that they've never met before, but they're now communicating with on an app on their phone, or through Facebook Messenger or Snapchat or Instagram, whatever the case might be. And these are the folks that are out there who are looking to exploit our most precious commodity, our kids, and oftentimes adults as well. because they pick up on, because people they put their life on social media today. Every emotion, every feeling, everything, and traffickers are very good at picking up on those emotional vulnerabilities, and they know exactly how to target those and establish relationships. And the next thing you know, you've got an inappropriate relationship between between two people. Maybe somebody's traveling, to meet the person, whatever the case might be, and now suddenly you've got a situation that may be very hard to get out of. Sex trafficking today it's really become largely an online business. That's not to say that there's not street level commercial sex that goes on. There is still, but it's not as prevalent as it once was. And I tell people who are typically around my age, if they think back to the TV shows that we watched as kids, Kojak, Starsky and Hutch, the real Starsky and Hutch, not the movie, the corny movie that they came out with a few years ago with Owen Wilson, but the real shows from the 70s, 80s, back then, before the internet was really a thing, they portrayed the commercial sex trade very differently. And they built a stereotype around women walking the streets with short skirts, halter tops, big hair, high boots, and what a pimp looked like as well. And that stereotype, I think, is really kind of carried on, to the perceptions of a lot of people today, and that's just what they think. But in reality, it's almost as easy to buy sex online today as it is to place an order on Amazon Prime. It's literally that simple. If you know where to go, and I could rattle off, probably 30 plus different websites or applications that can be accessed from a phone or through an app, in which you could go on and purchase commercial sex. Depending upon where you are in the country, the availability, the size of the area that you're in, it's very simple. I guarantee that, in Mobile or in Birmingham or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or Baltimore, Washington, D.C., any large population center, that you could go online right now, and literally have a connection and have a meeting planned to purchase commercial sex within the next probably 15 minutes, and have that act completed within the next hour. I mean, it's really just that prevalent. One, it's an easy way to reach a massive amount of people because everybody's got a cell phone, everybody's got a computer. The demand is always going to be there. It's largely anonymous. There's not a face-to-face transaction until the meet actually takes place. You can lie about your identity. You can put up a fake name, you can put up a fake picture, you can really kind of disguise who you are, so it makes you more anonymous, in case anybody goes digging around, looking, and that kind of thing. And so it's really become the way that commercial sex is largely sold, and it's not the only way, but it's a big way that commercial sex is sold. So with with minors today in human trafficking, and particularly sex trafficking, still the majority of minors today are being victimized through what we call familial trafficking, meaning that there's a family relationship between the minor and the person who is exploiting that minor for sale for commercial sex. So sometimes that could be a direct relative. So we've had moms and we've had dads selling their kids, grandparents involved in selling their kids. We've had sisters involved in selling their sisters for commercial sex. But sometimes it may just be a close family relationship or a family-like relationship that's developed over time. Again, it's not the stranger danger kind of thing that's happening. It's really happening as part of these close relationships. And it impacts really every level of society. There's not, again, if we think back to the 70s and 80s, and we think back to those stereotypes that were out there, those are the impressions that are burned into our mind about what a potential trafficking victim looks like, or what a prostitute looks like. And let me clarify this. There is a difference between human trafficking and prostitution. We tend to lump it all together. But at the end of the day, prostitution is a crime of choice. Human trafficking is a crime involving force, fraud, or coercion. Sex trafficking, the person really can't consent to the Commercial Sex Act because they're being pushed into it.
Do you mind if I bump into the question?
Sure.
So if you're conducting research and you're doing a John sting and you're wondering, and you're labeling this as human sex trafficking, how do you know if it's considered a human sex trafficking investigation and not just a prostitution investigation?
Well, that takes time, but that's a very good question, Celine. Very, very appropriate. Just so you know, Celine and I kind of have and Dr. Osatek, we kind of have a thing going and helping Celine with some of her research. So we never really know until we make contact with a potential victim as to whether or not that person is a victim of human trafficking or if they're selling themselves by choice. Some people will sell themselves by choice, one, because they just need to make the money. Maybe in some instances it's good money, but oftentimes it's because they need to fund a drug habit. Quite honestly, they're looking for just enough money to buy and re-up, for their meth or their heroin or whatever the case might be. And they will often tell us that, yeah, I'm doing this by choice. There are certain indicators, that we look at in terms of the profiles that they use to advertise themselves, that give us indicators as to whether or not this is potentially prostitution, or maybe this is actually human trafficking. There are some technical things some law enforcement sensitive things that we can do, and some tools that we can use that kind of help us peel back the layers, behind these ads, and find out, okay, hey, is this person who's really this hard up for, who says that they're just hard up for money, is that really the case? And if so, if they're that hard up for money, how has that person traveled? Because even though trafficking is not a crime of transportation, it's still a transient crime. they don't usually stay in one area for more than just a few days at a time, because they don't want law enforcement to become alerted to their presence, that kind of thing. So oftentimes they move on a circuit. But if you don't have a car and you don't have the money, how did you afford a plane ticket, or how did you get from point A to point B to point C to point D, back to point A? How are you paying for the hotel room? Those types of things. Or and a lot of times if we are doing a sting and we encounter a female, an indicator for us is, when we get into that room, if that female has been there for days at a time, say 3, 4, or 5 days, and they are being trafficked, we're not going to find money in the room. Now that female may have had sex with, or participated in some commercial sex act, with 10, 12, 15 clients a day, over a period of 3 to 4 days, maybe at an average cost of $150 an hour, maybe $200 an hour. So if you quickly do the math, you would think that there would be a lot of cash in that room. We won't find any cash because somebody's coming to pick up the money. That money is not staying with that victim, with that person. They're having to give that money to someone else. The money is going to the trafficker. If a person is just there simply to sell themselves, simply to prostitute themselves by choice, and they've been in that room for a couple of days, typically we're going to find cash, and we're going to find cash oftentimes in lesser amounts, than one might expect. So we really have to kind of do our homework, because you can't just look at a person and say, yes, they're a trafficking victim or they're selling themselves by choice. But that's a common denominator across, human trafficking. Kind of back to my point, we have this stereotype in our head, but that stereotype doesn't apply. It doesn't work anymore, because we encounter victims of trafficking, sex trafficking, who are from all levels of society. We find it occurring in very, very wealthy, affluent neighborhoods, and we see it in very depressed, socioeconomically depressed urban areas, and neighborhoods. So it's very hard to say that this is what a trafficking victim looks like. It's very hard to say this is what a trafficker looks like, because there's not that particular stereotype. And what I do tell people is that there is one common denominator that every trafficking victim has in common, whether it's a sex trafficking victim or a labor trafficking victim. And it's not something that you may necessarily see just by looking at that person, but the one common denominator among all trafficking victims is a vulnerability. It could be socioeconomic, it could be financial, it could be drug dependency, it could be their physical appearance, it could be a learning disability, you name it. We see traffickers who will prey upon those vulnerabilities. If it's drug dependency, that's easy. The promise, the promise that they will get drugs to feed their addiction if they just do this, that's just such an easy sell for some people who are severely addicted. Other traffickers, they prey upon the emotional vulnerabilities of victims, and they will establish relationships and Sometimes they will swoop in and try and be the best friend, the father figure. We've had traffickers who have, over a period of time, they've groomed their victims. And in one particular case I'm thinking of, we had a young girl who, from a single family home, a family friend, took it upon himself to, kind of become that father figure, and began to buy the girl clothing, nice clothes, so she'd fit in at school. Bought her a new phone so that she could communicate whenever she needed to, but also fit in with her friends at school. Paid for a tutor to help get her grades up, to help with her self-esteem, and just kind of really showered affection on her, not sexual affection. And that's the thing. A lot of times, especially with minors, the traffickers won't engage in sexual conduct with the minors, because it only takes one mistake, one word of that kid to a school counselor or teacher, someone who's a mandatory reporter, and the whole gig is up, at that point. So it's risky. They play the father figure. They play the Romeo in that scenario. And in this case, he earned the trust of this young girl who was 11 years old, gained the trust of this 11-year-old girl's mother, and said, to the point that he had kind of become a fixture in her life, and eventually convinced the mother to allow him to take his daughter, or her daughter, out of town for the weekend. Now, you can put a lot of blame on the mother in this case, and I'm sure you would all nod your head. Yeah, this isn't sounding good, but it happened. And he took this 11-year-old girl, drove her about an hour and a half, 2 hours to another city, here in this state, on a Friday night, waited till she got out of school, because he was being responsible, right? Waited till she got out of school on a Friday, drove her a couple of hours to this other city here in the state. That Friday night, she was raped 15 times as an 11-year-old girl. She was sold 15 times for sex. And I call it rape because that's what it is. She was a minor, she couldn't consent. But that's the type of fraud and coercion that a lot of these traffickers will use to target the vulnerabilities, of these victims. And I've already mentioned that drug use is very, very common. Opioid addiction, meth, those are really kind of the drugs of choice. They are people who become addicted really develop hardcore dependency on those drugs. I don't know if you've ever worked with or been around a heroin addict who is coming down or is going through withdrawals from their opioid addiction. But it is an absolutely horrible thing to witness. It is painful. It is nauseous. It is, people just want to die. Opioid withdrawal is it's not typically fatal. It's not considered fatal, but people want to die because it's such a horrible, horrible experience. Well, you only have to go through that experience once to know that you never want to go through that experience again. So you're going to do whatever you have to do to get that, the next fix. Same thing with meth. And so you're developing a population of trafficking victims who are often addicted to drugs. You have the presence of sexually transmitted disease, pregnancy, and a lot of other health issues that may be the result of a force that's being used to to continue to coerce these women to stay involved in this type of activity. And now we have to have a community of people who are specifically trained, to deal with this, to deal with this victimized population. So it is a public health issue as well. We tend to take a very victim-centered approach to the work that we do in HSI. So we actually have a policy, a formal policy that says that in our investigations, we are going to take a victim-centered and trauma-informed approach to the way that we work with victims. So if we work with our partners, our state and local partners, oftentimes to do a sting operation, and we have undercover officers or undercover agents who are calling or texting the ads that are placed online and setting up dates, and the girls are showing up at a hotel room, and then we're listening to the conversation. We wait till the deal is made. We kind of come through the door, surprise the person who's there, the female typically, who is about to engage in a commercial sex transaction. We don't arrest the females. It's contrary to what law enforcement has traditionally done, because traditionally law enforcement has been very case-based or stat-based or prosecution-based. And so typically the girl would just get arrested for solicitation of prostitution. In earlier years, the same would have held true for a minor. And back when I began my career, if we had a 14 or a 15-year-old girl who solicited an undercover vice detective for sex, we arrested her and charged her with solicitation of prostitution. And she went before a juvenile magistrate. She went to the juvenile detention center, and she got a criminal record. We don't do that anymore because there's no benefit to law enforcement in arresting the victims. And I'll caveat that by saying that that's not to say that sometimes victims don't get arrested. There can be extenuating circumstances. For instance, if we encounter a female who has an outstanding felony warrant, and it's an extraditable warrant to another state, to another jurisdiction, by law, because we are law enforcement officers and we're sworn to uphold the laws of the United States, if we validate that warrant, we are bound by law to execute that warrant. We do not have a choice. We have to execute that warrant. We have to take that person into custody and serve that warrant and make notice to the jurisdiction that issued that warrant has been served. There are other cases where we've encountered some other serious very serious charges that we couldn't turn our back on. But the majority of the time we don't arrest the victims. The idea for us, and here's why. When we're talking about the crime of human trafficking, and we're talking about crime in general, but specifically human trafficking, what other crime in the United States does law enforcement arrest the victims? Think about it. When is the last time law enforcement arrested a victim in order to help them? When is the last time law enforcement arrested a homicide victim? We don't arrest victims. So why are we arresting human trafficking victims And why are we arresting human trafficking victims with the rationale that we're trying to help them? Our approach is much different. We work very collaboratively. We work in multidisciplinary teams. And when we're doing operations, we have trained advocates, victim service providers who are right there with us. When we encounter a female, our goal is to build a trafficking case. We're looking at who drove you to the hotel, because they're not going to drive themselves. The trafficker or somebody that works for the trafficker is going to drive them to the hotel. That's who we're focused on. We want to build that. We want to build that trafficking case, shut down that trafficking organization. And we recognize putting this girl in jail where she's just going to bond out a few hours later is not going to, it's not going to help us. The victims in these cases, typically, they don't want to talk to us anyway when we first encounter them. They believe that when they are encountered by us, they're just going to jail. And so when we come into the room and we encounter this victim, we make sure that she's safe, and we immediately hand this victim off to a trained advocate who's not law enforcement, who's only there to provide for her needs, to get her to shelter, to get her somewhere safe to sleep, to give her new clothes, to get her fed, to get her counseling, to get her a physical exam, to meet all of those physical needs. It's revolutionary to them because they've never been treated like this before. And if we can get them, if we can get them out of that situation and we can get them somewhere stable, it might not happen the next day, it might not happen the first week, but usually within the first couple of weeks, because they've established a bond of trust with the advocate, and the advocate is able to speak on our behalf, and they understand why we did what we did. They begin to build a sense of trust with us, and they'll come back and they'll talk to us about their case. We are not stat driven when it comes to these types of cases, and that we only care about prosecution. DHS, the Department of Homeland Security Investigations, puts the same value from a statistic standpoint or from an outcome standpoint of us recovering or rescuing a victim as there is to making a successful prosecution. And that is a huge change in law enforcement. So that's really kind of our victim-centered approach. I mean, we do other things. We do John stings, in which we target commercial sex buyers. We did an operation this past weekend, and in 2 nights, a Friday and Saturday night, we arrested 20 individuals who answered our undercover ads, posed by undercover agents and officers, and showed up at a location thinking that they were going to buy commercial sex. And we arrested those individuals and charged them under state crimes for attempting to purchase commercial sex. 5 of those individuals actually answered ads thinking that they were coming to have sex with a 14-year-old girl. And so 5 of those individuals, were charged with felonies, in addition to, the other crimes and other things. I think all in all, we had 20 people charged. We arrested 20 people, but there were 32 or 34 criminal violations and charges that were filed on those 20 individuals. That's a deterrent. We do that enough, and we tend to see the demand for commercial sex go down. Maybe not the physical demand for commercial sex go away, because that desire is always going to be there. The physical desire is always going to be there. But we ratchet down the frequency of that type of activity in a particular area because we're arresting buyers. Ultimately, word gets out. People see the articles in the paper and in the news, and they see the pictures of the people who are being arrested and charged. And that's a pretty big deterrent, because people recognize they don't want to see their name in the paper. They don't want to see their name on the news, being charged for that type of activity. We take that same victim-centered approach with foreign nationals. So, the 1,000-pound elephant in the room, the gorilla in the corner, whatever you want to call it. We are the Department of Homeland Security. And within my organization, we have the authority to enforce U.S. immigration law. Typically on the HSI, with HSI, we're principally focused on serious criminal violations of U.S. immigration law, not so much the administrative side, and not the detention, the deportation, and that type of thing. But we are a border agency. We do have that authority. But what I tell people all of the time is that we do not, and we never have, deport victims. We don't. As a matter of fact, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is the most recent legislation, the TVPA of 2000, which the most modern piece of legislation that we have dealing with, with the crime of human trafficking, actually makes it illegal or unlawful for us to deport a trafficking victim. So if we encounter a foreign national who's a victim of human trafficking, and say this foreign national, this non-citizen of the United States, maybe they're unlawfully present in the United States, they have no legal status to be here, they could otherwise be removed from the United States and sent back to where they've come from. If we encounter them and we have reason to believe, just a mere suspicion to believe that person is a victim of human trafficking, we can grant that person, that individual, a benefit called continued presence. Continued presence is an immigration benefit that's 2 years in duration. And it allows that person to live lawfully, legally in the United States, get a job, get work authorization, get a social security card, driver's license, whatever they need to do. And we can renew that every 2 years for that individual. It's really the difference between reasonable suspicion and probable cause. If you've ever studied those two terms in criminal justice or in criminal law, all we have to do is have a reasonable suspicion to believe that they're a trafficking victim to give them continued presence. If we have probable cause, the preponderance, the overwhelming preponderance of evidence that person is in fact a trafficking victim, then we can get that person a trafficking visa, a T visa. That's a more permanent form of immigration relief. It allows that person to stay in the United States for 4 years, but again, we can renew that every 4 years. After that person has had that T visa for 3 years, they can apply for lawful permanent residency in the United States. They can become a green card holder. Basically one step below U.S. citizenship. About the only thing that they can't do is vote, and they can't get a U.S. passport. They can get a travel document that allows them to travel, but they can't get a passport. They can't vote, but they are a lawful permanent resident of the United States. After they've been a lawful permanent resident for 10 years, they can become a U.S. citizen. That's what we do for trafficking victims. And I will tell you that despite maybe some of the evil things that you hear about us on the news, I will say this, and I will back this up. There is no other agency in the United States government, no other federal law enforcement agency in the United States government that does more to provide services and to provide help to victims and vulnerable populations than does HSI and the Department of Homeland Security, period. And nobody can touch what we do. And it was that reason that actually led me, when I began my law enforcement career over 30 years ago, state and local law enforcement, before I made a move to the federal government. And back before there was a Department of Homeland Security, back when, and before they took all these agencies and kind of put them together and HSI was created and everything else, I worked for the Immigration and Naturalization Service. I went to work for INS because I recognized that INS special agents spent the majority of their time helping vulnerable people, rescuing people from violent, human smuggling organizations, investigating international human trafficking organizations, seeing people who are being exploited through, illegal employment schemes, tracking down international human rights violators and war criminals who were responsible for horrible atrocities and genocides across the world. That's why I went to work for this agency, because I recognize the work that we did back then, and we do even more of it now. And our role in human trafficking is really just it's an outgrowth of that. It's an outgrowth of the establishment and the creation of this organization that we have now called Homeland Security Investigations. And we're the only agency in the federal government that has the authority to investigate all forms of human trafficking, both domestically, internationally, whether it involves adults, minors, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, forced child labor, you name it. We do it. It's not the only thing that we do. We investigate a lot of other crimes, over 450 crimes we have primary statutory authority for. But it is a big priority for us, because it's a big priority for this nation. And it's an important issue for the victims. And we want to help people at the end of the day. And I've seen so much in the way of human trafficking, and crimes like human trafficking that are exploitative in nature, to see that that the people who undertake these crimes, the people who facilitate these crimes, have really little or no value of human life in general. They just don't care. They're solely motivated by greed, and that's what drives them to commit these acts. So I don't know are there some questions, Jen, or?
Well, we have one from Celine, so I know your mic is working, so I will let you ask it.
Yeah, I wrote in, I know when you were talking a little bit earlier, before we were talking about victims getting visas to stay in the country, but you were talking about how the HSI uses a victim-centered approach. And I didn't know if the TVPA was something that all law enforcement were held to. Is that just good practice, or is that like a law that they must follow that puts victims first? Are there law enforcement out there that continue to arrest victims of human trafficking?
Yes. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is a federal law. The TVPA, I don't know if it necessarily specifies a victim-centered, trauma-informed approach. That's DHS policy. It's policy and it's best practice. And we've talked a little bit about this. But states have their own trafficking laws too. And there's really a lack of standardization and a lack of protocol nationally, between agencies and sometimes neighboring jurisdictions about how to work these cases. And unfortunately, when there's a commercial sex problem within a particular area, a quote unquote prostitution problem, whatever. Sometimes it's the mayor, sometimes it's the city council, it's the police chief that says, do something about this. And the quickest and easiest way to do something about it is just to go out and arrest everybody. And I've always said that law enforcement, we're very good at arresting ourselves out of a problem. We see a crime, we take action, we arrest the perpetrator, the crime ends. If you're a local police officer, state and local, and like I said, I spent a lot of time in that realm. If we got called out to a disturbance call, at a house, drunk and disorderly, the first time we got out there in the night, we tell everybody to knock it off, be quiet, settle down, whatever, and we would leave. If we got called back a second time, it would be either calm down or the next time you're going to jail. If we get called back a third time, that problem maker is going to jail that night. Otherwise, we're going to keep getting called out over and over and over and over again. So we can arrest ourselves out of that problem. We can solve that problem for the night. But in human trafficking, like with other crimes, you have real victims. You have victims who have been exploited horribly, tremendous amounts of trauma, emotional, physical abuse, long-term enduring physical trauma to their bodies. And if all we're doing is arresting the perpetrator, are we really accomplishing justice? What about justice for the victims? What are we doing? What are we doing to help them? What are we doing to help them stop being victimized over and over and over again? Because if all we do is arrest them, they're going to get bonded out by their trafficker, by their pimp, and they're going to be back out on the street the next day being exploited again and again and again and again. And it's that cycle. And the only way to put a stop to it is if we turn our attention to really helping the victims. We don't want to stop making cases. We don't want to stop trying to put traffickers in jail. But we've got to help the victims. Otherwise, we're not seeing justice fulfilled.
Okay, so I know Celine was going to give us like a really brief overview of her project, but before we do that, does anybody else have any questions that we can ask Doug? Either you can type them in the chat and I will read them, or if you want, you can unmute and ask him.
Can I listen to Celine's presentation?
Of course.
Okay.
All right, well, it doesn't look like there are any questions immediately, so I'll keep watching the chat box. And Celine, you want to give us an overview of what you're working on with Doug right now?
Yeah, I can do a quick overview.